Undersea cables are critical to national security, and yet we continue to see just a lack of attention being paid to protecting this critical infrastructure in an adequate way.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Eugenia Lothri, Lawfare's Fellow in Technology Policy and Law, with Kevin Frazier, Assistant Professor at St. Thomas University College of Law, and Lawfare's Tarvel Fellow.
If you knew that you were relying on Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft for 99% of our internet traffic, then surely we would have a bit of more public pressure on these companies to be more responsible owners and more responsible stewards of this critical infrastructure.
Today, we're talking about the importance of undersea cables and how to protect them. Now, undersea cables carry more than 95% of the world's digital traffic. I think that's the line that absolutely every single article or paper about undersea cables needs to start with. Now, this makes them both an asset and a target, particularly at a time of heightened tensions like we're living in today. And in the past few years, I think we've seen increased interest, not just in the danger that is posed to them by accidents or acts of nature, but also the way in which state actors can tamper with the cables. But before we go into all of that, Kevin, let's just start with the basics. Can you go maybe a little bit deeper into what function the undersea cables play?
I love the pun to start with, going deeper for undersea cables. It's perfect. So undersea cables are the foundation of our internet. As you pointed out, upwards of 95% of all internet traffic travels across these cables. And there are a couple things to point out about them. First, they're about the size of a garden hose. So your internet is traveling over a garden hose that is thousands of miles long, which is just crazy to think about to begin with. The second incredible stat is that there are more than 800,000 miles of internet cables laying across seafloors around the world. And there are more than 600 cable systems. So just those stats alone are really important to see the scale of this critical infrastructure that allows our modern economy, all of our information, all of our politics to occur at the speed of light, at the speed of the internet. So that's important to set the ground floor. The next really important thing to realize is that the vast majority of these undersea cables are owned by private actors. So imagine if our interstate highway system, which we rely on for trade, which we rely on for recreation, and all of these important attributes of our modern day-to-day living, imagine if all of those roads were owned by private actors. That would really change how we thought about the governance of those roads, the maintenance of those roads, as well as potential threats to those roads. Now, when you think about the critical infrastructure that is our internet infrastructure, the significance of protecting these cables increases tenfold at a minimum. And so how we regulate this critical infrastructure is a really big challenge. Because they are so physically vulnerable, being just the width of a garden hose, and because there's so many of these cables, it really is a difficult challenge to protect this critical infrastructure.
Now, let's talk a little bit about what you need to protect them against, right? We mentioned some at the beginning of the conversation, but what are the different type of risks to the cables? Let's dive into that.
I love it. I'll have to try to catch up to you. Usually in my professorial role, my students are already rolling their eyes at my puns, but I may have to invite you to be a guest lecturer for one of my classes. In terms of the threats, they're usually broken down into two categories. The first is intentional breaks to cables. So when you think about bad actors going in and intentionally causing damage to a cable, or tapping into a cable to conduct an espionage mission. That's one set of threats. The other more prevalent set of threats are unintentional breaks. So when we think about unintentional breaks, those can be distinguished by two categories even further. The first would be natural breaks. So this is everything from earthquakes causing a break to landslides causing a break in a cable, or hurricanes, or even something as simple as a rock going over one of these cables can result in a break. Other unintentional breaks are caused by human actors, and these are generally the plurality of causes for breaks. So about 40% of breaks are caused by fishermen, right? You can just imagine dropping nets or dropping anchors, and then those grab one of the cables on the seafloor and result in a break. So that's a really big threat to these cables, and is one that is kind of hard to prevent because, as we'll dive into, I'm sure, there's a trade-off between making these cables more well-known to, let's say, fishermen or other boaters or other commercial interests, and then preventing bad actors from knowing those locations. And so how you choose to disclose the location of cables and try to prevent against each of these different types of threats is a really tricky question for national security interests to resolve.
Now that's interesting, right? Because usually when you do hear about undersea cables, which is not that often, it's more about the concern about Russia secretly cutting the cables or China is now tampering with them. So, it does pose an interesting challenge to think about those. You don't really hear about the accidental challenges to the cables.
Yeah, you're spot on, right? There's this, it's not exactly headline grabbing to say landslide wipes out undersea cable. That just sounds like kind of a normal occurrence, not something to get up in arms about. But really, it is important to pay attention to just how severe these natural events can be. So, by way of example, during the tsunami in Japan, a decade back or so, they had 8 cables break all at once. If just a few more cables had broken, there was a chance they would have lost most of their internet connection to the United States. So when you think about how these natural events can cause huge internet outages, then the stakes are greatly increased. It's also important to point out that all countries aren't like the United States. So the United States has dozens and dozens of different cables, a sort of redundancy, so that if there is some accidental break in a cable, well, that traffic can just move on to another cable. No harm, no foul. No one will really notice. They won't see any sort of disruption to their internet. For some countries, they just have one cable. And if that one cable goes, well, then all of a sudden you're relying on your internet traffic going up into space. And even though we like to think of space as so fast, and we've got all the satellite infrastructure connecting everyone, well, actually, internet traffic traveling on an undersea cable is 5 times faster than it would travel via satellites. So really protecting this undersea cable infrastructure system is very important to our global economy as well as to political stability.
We'll get to Starlink eventually in this conversation, but just to get a sense of the impact that just one of these cables going down could have, what happens after they're done? How long does it take to repair, to replace them? What is the sequence of events before you can regain that connectivity?
So this is a huge issue. As you can imagine, the money-making business in the undersea cable system is installing new cables. So there are a lot of efforts going on, predominantly led by Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta to lay new cables. We're seeing about 28 new cable projects a year ago, and that number of cables being laid is increasing as we become more and more reliant on the undersea cable infrastructure. So a lot of the ships that are built out to lay these cables are exclusively being used by these private massive corporations to lay new cables. Well, that means there's a lot of undersea cables that, if they break, are reliant on just, and I'm not joking, 20 to 30 undersea cable repair ships. That's it. So you have this aging infrastructure of old undersea cable repair ships that oftentimes are renovated tugs or renovated ferries. They're not even exclusively designed to repair these cables. So you've got that part of the equation where we just don't have a lot of repair ships to begin with. That's one complicating factor. The second complicating factor is that a lot of these cables are indeed aging. So the usual lifespan of an undersea cable is about 25 years. A lot of the cables that were laid, let's say at the beginning of the dot-com boom, are coming up on that expiration date. And you can see that obviously if you leave a garden hose at the bottom of the ocean for 25 years, well, suddenly it becomes a lot more susceptible to a usual break. So what we need are more cable repair ships. What we need are new cables. But when it comes to those new cables, we're seeing those same supply chain issues that we've heard about in other contexts with respect to critical infrastructure. Right now, there's a backlog of companies trying to build new undersea cables. And so it often takes years for them to get the supplies necessary to lay a new cable, let alone to repair one that may be broken. In terms of actually repairing an undersea cable upon a break, it is a complicated, expensive, and time intensive endeavor. So I mentioned earlier how we saw many cables break in the wake of the Japanese earthquake about a decade or so ago. Well, the process of going deep into the ocean floor, finding that cable, bringing it all the way up to the surface, and then repairing it is a complicated endeavor. It often takes dozens and dozens of times to try to get that cable to the surface and repair it in the proper manner. Another reason why that's so difficult is we're seeing this undersea cable repair labor force is also aging. You don't have a lot of folks who, when you say, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they excitedly shout, oh, I want to go into undersea cable repairs. I can't wait to be in the middle of the Pacific in crazy weather trying to find this tiny little garden hose and repair it. So all of those factors make repairing undersea cables all the more difficult and expose this critical infrastructure to even more threats as we continue to see, as you mentioned, more attention finally being paid to securing and protecting this critical infrastructure.
What about market dominance? Who are the players here and where are they based? Because that is going to become more important as we move into the trusted suppliers part of the conversation. But just to get a sense, if the workforce is aging, there are, 30 ships that can do this work, who's benefiting from it? Where I'm getting with this, but what's the market like?
So the preponderance of new cables being laid are led by Google, Microsoft, Meta, and Amazon. So they are leading a lot of the new cable laying efforts. And now that we've seen an increased attention being paid to the importance of this critical infrastructure, we've started to see the US government get a little bit more involved in partnering with these private actors to make sure that they're laying cables that are up to date on the highest security standards and in terms of physical protection. So we're beginning to get more involvement of national governments. Of course, that cuts other ways as well. So China, for example, has been actively partnering with countries around the South China Sea, for example, to use its suppliers for undersea cables. Hence, the United States government has adopted an effort to try to work with those same countries to instead use more neutral or trusted suppliers of undersea cable materials. So this is a new battle on making sure that the infrastructure itself, the cables themselves, are being laid in a way that we know the odds of it being tapped or having that data directed in an unintended direction will be mitigated to some extent. In a similar fashion, in terms of this debate over how to spend these limited resources with respect to the undersea cable repair ships, well, now the US government is trying to prompt an increase in the number of undersea cable ships. So they are now investing a little bit more, making more funds available to some of these private undersea cable repair ships so that we have a more reliable set of ships to repair cables upon any break.
So in terms of countries, the two main actors that we should be thinking about here are the US and China, correct?
Well, of course, I should add a third, and the big one right now is Russia. So Russia has been one of the, how do I phrase this correctly? Let's say leaders in exploiting the vulnerabilities of the undersea cable infrastructure. So Russia has invested quite a bit in its own undersea cable repair ships, as well as in submarines with capabilities to identify undersea cables and perhaps tap into those undersea cables. So Russia's activities around the undersea cable critical infrastructure have been raising red flags for quite a long time. Way back in 2017, we saw the United Kingdom government issued a report actually published by now Prime Minister Sunak detailing the threats posed to the undersea cable system by the Russian government. And that 2017 report outlined a couple strategies to reduce the odds of Russia being able to cut those undersea cables and therefore disrupt relations between Europe and the UK and other partners, especially NATO allies, that may rely on those undersea cable systems to communicate with one another, to conduct business, and to protect themselves against potential invasions.
I'm interested in talking a little bit more about the US approach to ensuring trustworthiness, right? Because when we look, for example, at the recently released International Cyber and Digital Strategy, there's an entire line of effort dedicated to securing undersea cables. And part of that is highlighting the work that they've done through the Cables program, as I understand it. They're trying to promote trustworthy providers to these countries where China has has led the effort in laying the infrastructure. So I'm interested in your take because it seems to me a little bit insufficient in a way to say, well, China's giving they're giving you the infrastructure, but we're here to tell you not to do that, not to accept it. So what's the carrot in a way? How do you really convince other countries that they should follow your lead or that they, should really heed your advice on this case?
It's a tough sell, I'll tell you that much. If you were given the option between an undersea cable today or years from now, if you're an elected official in one of these countries, today sounds pretty good, whereas years from now might be a tough sell. So I do think the US is in a tough spot if we aren't able to offer actual cables, actually secure cables to these different nation states in a timely fashion. But I think your point about insufficiency is really an important point to hit on because this is not a new problem. And that's one talking point that I probably discuss too frequently. Way back in World War One, the UK government cut all but one undersea cable to Germany, and it used that one undersea cable to tap into German communications. Ever since then, we've known that undersea cables are critical to national security, and yet we continue to see just a lack of attention being paid to protecting this critical infrastructure in an adequate way. So I think the cables program is important in that it's increasing awareness for these other countries about the national security implications of, let's say, perhaps using a less secure cable provider. But we do need to do more. We need to make sure that these countries have access to undersea cable systems in a timely fashion and in a redundant fashion, right? So the key is not only to provide them with a single cable, but ideally to provide them with multiple cables. Because as I pointed out, just a single break in one cable, if that's all you have, can cause significant internet disruption, which no country wants to see happen. And I think another key aspect we need to be asking is, as we usher in a new generation of cables being laid by those big four, how are we going to make sure that these new cables are actually improvements upon past cables? And there are a whole slew of interesting policy ideas about how to make sure that cables are less likely to be broken intentionally or unintentionally that I think need to rise to the top of the US agenda.
Now, I don't mean to bash on on the State Department's work and to be, just to go through the entire list of activities that they list on the strategy, there's also, $22 million in partnership with Australia and Japan to help the East Micronesia cable that is built by a Japanese firm. And October of 2023, they also announced, along with Australia, investments of $65 million to fund future undersea cable connectivity for Pacific Island countries. Now, is $65 million enough? You've mentioned several times how much this is a very expensive process. Is $65 million? It sounds like a big number. Is it enough?
It sounds like a big number, but we really need a holistic approach to protecting undersea cables. So this goes beyond making sure you have access to a secure cable to begin with, but like I said, having multiple cables. So just affording the provision of a single cable likely isn't enough. And then secondarily, we need to be supporting our allies in developing holistic approaches to protect these undersea cables. So, for example, are we working with these allies to develop strategies like cable protection zones? So cable protection zones have been used, for example, in Australia and New Zealand to build out specific areas where cables are being laid. And within that cable protection zone, where those cables are laid, there's increased enforcement of which ships are going into those zones, what activities those ships are doing in those zones, so that there are reduced odds of that cable being broken by an accidental anchor drop or a fishing net that gets left behind or anything like that. So we need to make sure that we're not only helping them identify trustworthy suppliers, but also adopting strategies that are going to reduce the odds of the most common sources of breaks.
A few days ago, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal about U.S. officials warning about using Chinese cable repair services, where Ambassador Fick says that undersea cable security can't be assured if the lines are built, maintained, or repaired by suppliers who are subordinate to or are beholden to authoritarian governments. Now, I have a dual question here for you. One, are these risks hypothetical? Are these concerns about what could happen? Or do we know, at least out here in the public, do we know that undersea cables have been tampered with through these Chinese suppliers? And then the other side of the question is, because clearly this is all part of the great power competition between the US and China. There is a statement in this same article from, I believe, the Chinese ambassador in Washington, talking about this is the US just generalizing and smearing companies, and these companies are acting within the law. So when is it, a little bit too much? If indeed these are hypothetical risks, how do you balance, what you can warn about versus actually just mirroring companies who are doing the work?
Yeah, so to get to that first part of the question, I'd say that these are not hypothetical risks. Now, part of the issue in saying that is that I don't have very many instances in which I can point and say, here's an example of a bad actor intentionally breaking a cable. What we do have is a heck of a lot of coincidences, and I'll call them problematic coincidences. So, for example, we saw some cables snapped off of Scotland recently, where the ships that were last seen near those cables were Russian ships or Russian submarines. Well, if you see ships one day and a broken cable the next, if you put two and two together, then things start to look a little bit dicey. So we have a lot of those coincidences that suggest that we're seeing more bad actors trying to break these cables on an intentional basis. On that second question, though, because this is privately owned infrastructure being repaired by private companies, it gets really hard to identify who is responsible for what. Right? So in the example you're pointing out, we had the SB submarine systems, which is owned 51% ownership by China Telecom, which is a state-run operation. And so if we have these private repair ships being more or less owned by authoritarian governments, well, these private companies have really no choice but to rely on these cable repair ships. As I pointed out, there are only so many of these undersea cable repair ships. And so you have to rely on whichever ship is closest to try to get that cable back up and running as soon as possible. And that's why we're seeing the US government really double down on new investments in our own undersea cable fleet. Even if that fleet is made up predominantly of private ships, how can we support those private ships and identify more ships that we regard as trustworthy? And so for right now, there haven't been very many attributable breaks to any one bad actor or any one government, but I do think that's coming because companies are realizing and governments are realizing that they really need to up their ability to identify what the cause of a break was. And that's easier said than done, of course, but it's something that we've managed to do in the past. So in the Cold War, for example, the US and its allies developed a really impressive sonar system to be able to detect USSR submarines. It was state of the art and something that we allowed to go into disuse, more or less. But this is technology we can surely emulate in 2024 and improve upon in 2024. So, for example, there have been calls to make sure that all cables being laid are equipped with certain sensors so that we're better able to detect when a ship may be nearing. And if there is a break, well, now we can use that information to trigger a response to national security actors and be able to increase the odds of attributing a break to whatever that last ship in the vicinity was.
There's another story, another recent story regarding undersea cables that I would like to get your thoughts on. Recently, the FCC settled an investigation on unauthorized connections to international cables to the United States. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that investigation was about and what the settlement means?
Yeah, so the FCC is tasked with licensing cables that are connected to the United States. And as a part of that FCC review process, they've long had a practice of asking the DoD, DHS, and the DOJ to analyze the national security implications of any sort of new cable being laid or any sort of cable landing site being developed. And that process has become more formal as of 2020. So in 2020, the Trump administration directed the FCC and the DOJ, the DHS, and the DoD to create what's known as Team Telecom. So Team Telecom took what used to be sort of an informal process of reviewing these cable licensing applications and made it much more formal. So now Team Telecom goes through and reviews these licensing applications in a much more rigorous manner and a more efficient manner to see whether or not there are any national security issues with granting one license or another. Well, in this case, we saw two cable providers tried to bypass that Team Telecom process, and the FCC said, no go, right? You need to pay a fine and make sure that you are going to adhere to this process going forward. So I think this is a really important development in our national security attention to undersea cables, making sure that we have a robust review of any sort of new cable landing site or any new cable is incredibly important to increasing the resiliency of our undersea cable system. So this was an important development to show to cable providers around the world and cable owners around the world that if you're going to work with the FCC, then you are going to have to go through this Team Telecom process and really have a close look into the national security implications of any license.
Now, you've been clearly thinking about this issue for some time. And in a piece on Lawfare last year, you discussed the inadequate attention given to the cable's protection and also insufficient awareness of their significance. Now, when you look at all of these different things that we've been discussing, the FCC settlement and investigation, the State Department's activities, even this reporting on government warnings about suppliers, do you think this is kind of a blip in attention given to the issue, or is this a significant change?
I do think we're seeing a significant change because we've seen Russia increase its capacity to wreak havoc on undersea cables and to exploit its capacity to wreak havoc with respect to Ukraine and the invasion into Crimea back in 2014. That's sending a lot of clear red flags to national security officials in the US, in the UK, and to our allies as well. And so I do think this is a moment where we're going to turn the dial and really make this a matter of national security. How we go about addressing this issue, though, is incredibly complicated. And the chief issue is enforcement. So when you think about, for example, a cable protection zone, the United States has quite an expansive coastline, dozens and dozens of cables connected to our coasts. So creating cable protection zones where we would mandate cables be laid and we would subject those zones to increased oversight is a very costly endeavor. So for example, we've seen that cable protection zones in Australia haven't really worked all that well because they didn't pair the creation of a cable protection zone with an increase in enforcement resources. In contrast, in New Zealand, where admittedly there are quite a small number of undersea cables, cable protection zones have actually worked out quite well to reduce the odds of intentional or unintentional breaks to cables because it's easier to enforce that zone. So if the US decides to take this issue more seriously, which I think it will, then cable protection zones may not be the right route for us. Instead, we may need to look to more creative solutions. So one of those creative solutions would be laying what are called dark cables. So whereas most cables being laid right now, it is open source information as to where that cable comes to rest, what its cable landing location is. And as a result, it's relatively easy to try to map out where that cable actually lays on the ocean floor. A dark cable, in contrast, would have its location remain secret to everyone but the owner and the applicable governments. And so a dark cable would reduce the odds of bad actors being able to discover where those cables are being laid. And that all sounds great, right? Why not have these dark cables that no one can find, right? They're buried in a secret location. Well, the flip side of that is it increases the odds of those sorts of unintentional breaks, a commercial fisher dropping their anchor, for example. And so you really have to decide how you're going to weigh that tension. Now, one set of solutions that I think needs to have more juice, for lack of a better phrase, is a three-part approach that I laid out in Lawfare last year. And that involves information gathering, information sharing, and increased deterrence. So with respect to information gathering, we need to make sure that public and private actors are working together to share as much information as possible about where ships are, when cables experience breaks, so that we can increase attribution, right? In many ways, this is kind of similar to a traditional cyber attack, where we've seen the creation of different information sharing platforms and different efforts to increase information gathering so that it's more easy to attribute an attack to a single actor. So if we have more information being gathered and shared, then I think we can really increase the odds of being able to identify who may have caused a certain break. Now, the third prong of that, deterrence, is also really important. So right now, under the 1888, yes, that's right, 1888 Submarine Cable Act, any American or anyone who causes damage to an undersea cable in the US is subject to a $5,000 fine. Well, is that a big deterrent if, let's say, you've got a huge catch that you want to protect, or you're willing to front that cost. It doesn't seem like an adequate deterrent, and may just be a cost of doing business, right? You drop your anchor, you take out a cable, you pay $5,000. Not that big of a deal. We need to increase deterrence by significantly updating the fines and potential jail time associated with damaging an undersea cable.
So that is quite a range of solutions. If you clearly have this three-pronged approach, but if you had to choose a place to start, what's the low-hanging fruit here? Clearly, making this change sounds pretty straightforward, but if you had to choose a place to start, the lowest hanging fruit, what is it?
The lowest hanging fruit is just build better cables. So if we have cables that are more resilient to things like landslides, earthquakes, anchor drops, then we can reduce the odds of needing them to be repaired to begin with. I think it's important to always go back to the fact that 40% of cable breaks are caused by fishing activity. As much as the activities from Russia and China are grabbing headlines, we do just need to make sure this cable infrastructure remains resilient. And one of the best ways to do that is to just lay better cables. Of course, that comes at quite a cost. The second solution that I think is really important is just making sure that we are building redundant systems. So the more cables we can lay is also an important place to start. Now, third, and again, I don't think this is asking too much, is creating standards about mandatory distances between cables. So believe it or not, we don't even have standards about how far apart different cables need to be when they're laid on the seafloor. It's pretty easy to just start there and say, let's make sure we have a specified distance for separating these cables out so we can avoid, one anchor or one earthquake breaking multiple cables all at once. So those are three relatively easy, albeit very expensive steps that we could begin to take.
Now, this might just be my cyber brain trying to bring something that I understand more of to the conversation. But when you mentioned that the first step, or the lowest hanging fruit would be to, let's just build better cables. It's hard for me not to think about a lot of the discussion around software liability that we're having in the US right now, where there's the push to, saying, well, like, you're a software developer, you should be held responsible for the security outcomes that could have been anticipated. So I am wondering about what the incentives here are for the companies that are laying down the cables. What happens when they don't choose the best, most secure cable to lay down? Is there, that kind of liability incentive, or is this just oh, well, that happened?
So this is a really interesting point that is receiving more attention. So right now we've seen that there's no real public onus on these companies to, let's say, develop a more robust undersea cable. There are, in some cases, obviously specific requirements that the FCC would look at as part of its licensing process. But there's no, let's say, real significant financial pressure beyond their own interest in not having a cable be broken, right? And the significant costs that come with repairing an undersea cable. But it was recently disclosed, for example, in the Philippines, that they created their own public insurance body so that if there is a break in an undersea cable, they can more quickly get the funds necessary to help repair that cable system. And so that's the sort of creative approach to making sure that there are funds available for expedited repairs of these cables that I think deserves more attention. Right now, there's not a whole lot of pressure on the owners of these cables necessarily to go above and beyond to protect our undersea cable infrastructure. And that's where I think public awareness is really important. If you knew that you were relying on Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft for 99%, they don't own all the cables, but these private owners for 99% of our internet traffic, then surely we would have a bit of more public pressure on these companies to be more responsible owners and more responsible stewards of this critical infrastructure. And so that's why I think it's so important that we have more people talking about this fascinating area where we are so reliant on private owners for such an important public service.
Here we are on the podcast. We're doing our part.
Exactly. One podcast at a time, and then we'll get the internet infrastructure we deserve.
This is how real change happens. So a word that you've mentioned a lot throughout the conversation is redundancy, right? And the importance of that for security. And many of the policy solutions that you've discussed focus on securing the cables themselves. But I'm wondering, is there room for alternatives to them that also support them, right? And you kind of hinted at this before. We talked about satellites, and there's been maybe some overhyped discussion about the role that something like Starlink could play, or if it could, replace the undersea cables, which doesn't really sound like feasible. But even if it does not replace them, can it support them as a way to create this redundancy?
The curt answer would be no. The curt answer being no is because the fiber optic cables are built out to what's known as the 5 nines standard. So the ability of these fiber optic cables to just expedite the transfer of internet traffic is kind of unparalleled. And so the fact that internet travels 5 times faster on these undersea cables is really what makes it so difficult to say, oh, we'll just rely on more satellites, for example. So that's why I think it is so important to stress the redundancy of the cables themselves. So things we can look at, though, are how can we make sure that the repair of these undersea cables happens in a timelier fashion? And so that really does require building out a whole fleet of undersea cable repair ships, something that really hasn't been a topic of enough conversation, in my opinion. And it also requires training a new set of laborers to replace those who have been on these ships for decades and who were kind of the pioneers in building out these undersea cable systems. And thirdly, I'd add that there is an opportunity to try to improve upon the techniques that we've been relying on to repair these undersea cables. So if you were to take someone from 1850 and transport them onto a boat in 2024, they would say, oh, great, we'll just use the same exact approach to repairing undersea cables. This is easy smeezy. I've seen this before. Let's just, run the playback. We should come up with new innovative methods to make sure that we can repair these cables in an expedited way. Surely, if we can create AI and get close to artificial general intelligence, then we can come up with a better way to repair these undersea cables.
Well, and with that call to action, I think that's a great point to wrap up our conversation. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to future conversations about the importance of this critical infrastructure.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Patia, and your audio engineer this episode was Noam Osvand of Go Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.